Good day, and today we're going to look at a bit of a background for Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol. In particular, we're going to be looking at the context and how the Christmas Carol comes into being. Let's start with the author, Charles Dickens. Born in 1812, Charles Dickens' father was imprisoned for debts, and because of this, Dickens is going to be removed from school and find himself working in a factory as a child. Now, shortly afterwards, he is taken back out of the poverty and put into a private school when Dad inherits a fortune. But after this, your author, Charles Dickens, was very passionate about the poor. Now, because he was a lower middle class boy, he worked in a factory and his family needed extra money. You're going to see that pop up again quite frequently in the stories that Charles Dickens will write. He also lived during the time period in Victorian England. So at this time, the gap between the poor and rich was much, much bigger than it is today. The contrast between those who are rich and poor was definitely shocking. Those who were poor lived in squalor, deprivation, dirt, and misery. They barely had enough money or food to even survive. Child mortality was very high, and there was no established health care. If you got ill and could not work, your whole family was at risk of death. At this time period in the 1830s and on, the workhouse was the only option for many British families, where at least they'd be fed and housed. However, at the workhouse, families were split up, and often conditions were crowded and no better. Those who were rich in early Victorian society lived in the exact opposite way. They had enormous houses, luxurious clothes, and servants. The rich people in Victorian England, most of them anyway, took little interest in helping the poor. They felt that poverty was that person's fault or a punishment, or at least something that could be avoided. Now, in the 19th century, there were developments in technology that meant many people stopped working on the land and instead moved into Victorian towns and cities to work in the factories. This meant that cities like London were overcrowded, and the working classes may have had up to 30 people living in one room. Children as young as 3 could be working in the factories. Those who could not cope were forced to join the workhouses. 3 out of every 20 babies would die before their first birthday in the 1830s and 1840s, around the time of Our Christmas Carol. And life expectancy for most is about 40 years. Now, workhouses were the only places where people who were too poor to survive could possibly get help. There were no social services, and charity were basically nonprofits that were done very seldomly in the cities. Conditions in the workhouse were made deliberately harsh in order to discourage people from having to even go there. Now, workhouses would vary in size. The smallest housed only 50 people, while the largest in cities would house several thousand. There were self-contained communities, and apart from the basic rooms, such as a dining hall for eating, day rooms for the elderly, and dormitories for sleeping, workhouses would often have their own bakery, laundry, tailors, and shoemakers, vegetable gardens and orchards, and even a piggery for rearing pigs. Now, entry to the workhouses was usually voluntary, but it was certainly the last choice for people. But people could end up in the workhouse for a variety of reasons. Usually it was because they were too poor, they were old, or too ill to support themselves. This may have resulted from such things as a lack of work during periods of high unemployment, or someone having no family willing or able to provide care for them when they became elderly or sick. Unmarried pregnant women were also often disowned by their families, and the workhouse was the only place they could go during and after the birth of their child. Prior to the establishment of public mental asylums in the mid-19th century, and in some cases even after that, the mentally ill and the mentally handicapped poor were also often consigned to the workhouse. Now, let's say you were going to be entering into the workhouse around 1835. The daily routine for the workhouse inmates prescribed by the Poor Law Commissioners in 1835 would be as follows. You can see we have the hour of rising, an interval for breakfast, the time to set out for work. You'd have a bit of a break for dinner, time that you would leave off work, a little bit of time for supper, and then when you would go to bed. So we can see as we start getting into the first week, you would rise at 6 a.m. and you would have 30 minutes for breakfast. You would start work at 7 and we work for 5 hours until noon. You would have an hour break and then you would work again from 1 to 6. So 10-hour work days. You would have an hour off after that 6 o'clock work and you would go to bed at 8 o'clock. Now, workhouse inmates, at least those who were capable of it, were given a variety of work to perform, much of which was involved in running the workhouse. The women did mostly domestic jobs, such as cleaning or helping in the kitchen or laundry. Some workhouses had workshops for sewing, spinning, and weaving, or other local trades. Others had their own vegetable gardens, where the inmates worked to provide food for the workhouse. Now, more often than not, meals followed a weekly rota, with meat featuring only on a limited number of meat days. The weekly menu at Hertford in 1729, for example, would comprise of, and you can see from Sunday through Saturday, at breakfast you would either get bread and cheese or broth. Dinner, you would usually have non-meat meals such as peas porridge or a hasty pudding or frumpty, but sometimes you would get ox head or meat. And back to supper, you would get broth and bread and cheese. Now, it does say that none are stinted as to the quantity. How much could you eat? Usually it would be everybody could eat until they were satisfied. Now, some of the foods that we have here, for example, peas porridge would be a baked vegetable product, which mainly consists of split yellow or Carlin peas, water, salt, and spices, often cooked with a bacon or a ham joint. Hasty pudding would be a pudding or porridge of grains that was cooked in milk or water. Frumpty was a dish consisting of wheat, milk, sugar, and spices. Your broth would actually be boiled from your meat, and you usually have barley, leeks, or onions with the seasoning. And gruel, you'd probably get oatmeal about 2 ounces, maybe a half an ounce of treacle or some other molasses or sugar, and maybe sometimes you would get salt and sometimes allspice. Now, in his book, the Reverend Thomas Robert Malthus, born February 1766 and death date of December 1834, he observed that an increase in a nation's food production improved the well-being of the nation's people. But the improvement was temporary because it led to a population growth. Now, in the past, populations grew until the lower classes suffered hardship and want. And at this point, they became vulnerable to famine and disease and often died. Malthus thought we would never have a truly perfect or utopian society because every time we came close to providing a great standard of life for everyone, the population would grow and the process would have to start again. This idea became known as the Malthusian controversy. Now, for our purposes, it's important to see the big influence that it had on author Charles Dickens. Now, Charles Dickens felt very strongly about the gap between the rich and the poor. And in the 1840s, he wrote A Christmas Carol to try and highlight the difference and make people think differently about their actions. Now, he also decides to set his book at Christmas time because you have to think, what does Christmas mean in our society? Now, Dickens did not write A Christmas Carol in chapters. His 5 staves provide the structure of his novella, like 5 verses of a song, or a carol, or even 5 stanzas of a poem. The Christmas Carol follows a 3-act structure consisting of first the inciting incident, the visit of Marley's ghost, the climax, Scrooge's sight of his own grave with the ghost of Christmas yet to come, and Scrooge's reformation in the resolution. We can also see the Gothic techniques that Charles Dickens uses. Now, Gothic fiction combines features of horror and romance. Your key features would include extreme emotion, usually fear. You might also have awe and fear of religion or the supernatural. And the atmosphere is very well described. It's very strong. Usually you're going to see some sort of mysterious kind of happening or event. The supernatural, such as ghosts and haunted houses, are very prevalent. Death and madness or insanity would be quite prevalent as well. And usually your settings with darkness and castles are also quite often used. The general characters to look for with Gothic techniques would include absolute tyrants, absolute villains. You're going to see absolute heroes, people who have extreme emotion with very strong atmospheres. And of course, with the supernatural, you're going to see magicians, demons, angels, and ghosts. Now, when we combine the Gothic with the time period, before Victorian times, the setting for Gothic novels was generally a castle or somewhere in the countryside that was dark and creepy and lonely. But in the Victorian times, it became popular to place Gothic novels in an urban setting, particularly in London. And one to bear in mind when reading A Christmas Carol is that the idea of sins having the power to curse and affect you or your family in the future. Lastly, what did our author do? He compared and contrasted the big difference between the rich and the poor. He's going to show wealthy society as being pleasant, ordered, and extravagant, which is going to contrast with presenting poor society as being disordered, barbaric, and unhappy. Thank you so much for stopping by to learn about the context and the background of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. If you'd like to learn more about the story itself, maybe its themes or characters, check out my other videos on Learning Language Arts channel. And as always, I'd appreciate it if you subscribed. Take care.